Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to give you a tour of Challenge 3. This is our third mapping challenge. It's not as self-explanatory, in my opinion, as the first two, so I just wanted to make a video to help walk you through it if you're working on it from home. So here's what you need. First, you need to open up this document. You should be able to find this on Moodle, but you'll see this first. So this first page is the worksheet that you're going to need to be filling out. The rest of this document is going to be materials. So if you're going to print it out and do it from home, I would just print out page 1 and use everything else digitally. You'll see why in a minute. Otherwise, you can make a copy of this document and you can put text boxes or whatever you want in here to make this work for you. The next thing you're going to need is this next page. First of all, you're going to need a collection of maps. To be able to access them, you'll need this link here. We'll go there in a second. The second thing the last thing you'll need are these question cards, and we'll get to the question cards in a minute. First, I just want to walk you through the maps, because once you understand the maps, then everything else will kind of fall into place. So when I open up these maps, it's going to look like this. It's going to say Canada and the United States Mapping Lab. If you just decide to scroll through here, you're going to see a big collection of maps, and they're all very colorful, which is why I would keep it digital, because I printed out in-class copies and they're all in grayscale, which is like black and white. So it's a little bit tougher to read. However, the color copy makes it much easier. So the folks in class got access to this as well. This last picture we are going to ignore. It is not necessary for this mapping challenge. We are going to stop at challenge 3. That one's for a later challenge. I think it's challenge 5 or something. So let's go through these maps. These maps are called thematic maps. You might hear the word theme in there, and that's because every map has a theme of its own. So this one is called physical features. This one is climates. You can read the title of these at the top of the page. But what you're going to notice about these maps is that they are all of the same thing. You see the same lines of longitude and latitude. You see the same region. I still see the United States and I see Canada. All the same stuff. The difference here is that each one gives you different information. This gives political boundaries. This shows economic activity. This shows population density, so on and so forth. So let me give you a brief overview of each map so that way you know what you're looking at. So we'll start with physical features. Now, we did our physical features mapping challenge. That was mapping challenge number 1. So you should hopefully remember that physical features are things like mountains, rivers, oceans, lakes, so on and so forth. These are things that we can see on the earth, things that we can observe. This map has a key at the bottom. You're usually going to want to look for a key here at the bottom. This one is about elevation. So this one is talking about how high up the land is, and it's actually measured in feet from sea level. So if you're looking at this elevation, over 10,000 feet above sea level is going to be in red. So you should see here that these red areas happen to pop up in our Rocky Mountains. The lowest parts of the land are in this dark green, and these areas are actually considered to be below sea level. That doesn't mean that these areas are necessarily covered in water. I mean, even we live in an area that is nearly below sea level. Doesn't mean that we're submerged in water. It just means that compared to where the water is, our land dips down. It's very low. It's very flat. So you can see near the mountains, too, that we don't just go from red to green. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. You start really, really high, and then you slowly get lower and lower, which is why you see us go from red to orange to yellow, and eventually, really far out, we get to green. So that is our thematic map on physical features. Let's go to climate zones. If you don't recall, climate is not just the weather of an area, how hot or cold it is, it's the weather over a long period of time. So if we're talking about Texas, the climate here would typically be hot and humid. Now, it still gets cold here, though. That doesn't change. But to say that the climate of Texas is cold and icy would not be accurate, because that's not normally the weather here. We stick with hot and humid because that would be the general expectation for weather over time. So let's look at climate here. At the bottom, our key shows us different climate zones. Now, we haven't talked about what these different zones are yet, and that's okay. I just want you to be able to connect what you see in the key to what you see on the map. For example, if you see this orange area here, whether you know what it means or not, you should be able to look in the climate zone and see that it means semi-arid. So let me briefly tell you about some of these climate zones, just so you know kind of what you're looking at. These top 3 options are ice caps, tundra, and subarctic. You should hear words like ice and Arctic and think that these are very cold. We see most of this up here in Canada in our state, Alaska, way up north. Then you see in the green areas here, these marine west coast, humid continentals, humid subtropical. You hear that word humid, you hear that word marine. Whoops, whatever, sorry, my light went out. And you should think wet. So areas like where we live are very humid, so that shouldn't be too much of a surprise. These areas are slightly wet. Now we get into these yellow and red areas. These are very dry, in which that makes sense, especially because if you're looking over here at California, that's where a lot of our wildfires happen. Arizona is very dry. So states like these, you should expect to see that they'd be dry because that's where they are in the country, and that's what their climate is like. But you also might know that information on your own. So now you can connect that information that you know to the map that you see on the screen. I went and turned my light back on. Let's continue. Our next thematic map is about vegetation zones. It looks kind of similar to our climate map. However, it gives us some different information. So down here, instead of it telling us about the temperature or the type of land that you might find, it's going to tell us about what you can find on the land. Is it grassy? Is it covered in ice? Is it covered in a forest? Is it covered in desert? That's what vegetation is. Vegetation is what can grow in an area. So again, we've got our ice caps and tundras. Shouldn't be shocking that that is still mostly up north. But then we have our areas of desert, grassland, which are just grassy areas. Then we even get into our forests, and you can see our forests are very heavy up north as well. So this is the vegetation map. It just talks about what can grow in the area, what the land might be like. This one is population density, and I think a lot of students really enjoyed this one. So the population density map, I'm going to zoom in down here to our key. Population density tells us how many people are in a certain area, but it mostly talks about how crowded it is. So in a square mile, which is a space that is 1 mile wide by 1 mile tall, 1 square big, we are talking about how many people live in an area that small. A square mile is very small. You can drive in a mile in a minute, maybe, a minute or less even sometimes. So it's a very short or very small space. So we're talking about how many people could live in that small amount of space. Now, it could be as little as under 2 people on average across a large span of land living in an area, all the way up to over 250 people in 1 square mile. That is a lot of people in one space. So let's see what we've got. You're going to see these purple areas that are very high in population density, very dense, near big cities like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Those are very heavily, highly crowded cities. However, you will notice that these yellow areas are not very densely packed. Now, if you're looking at this area right here, because the United States is pretty densely packed, it looks like lots of red areas, lots of orangish areas. Where does this big yellow spot come from? Well, you might remember that these are where our Rocky Mountains are. So it kind of makes sense that the Rocky Mountains aren't very densely populated because it's really hard to settle in the mountains. But you'll see populations kind of snuggle up as close as they can to those mountains without having to build through them or go over them. So that is our population density map. Oh, one more thing. You should see here that the size of the dot on a city tells you how many people live there. Now, New York City actually has over 8 million people. So you'll see that the New York City dot is really large. Whereas some of these dots like San Diego are pretty small, they still have 1 million to 4 million people living there. That is a lot of people. But the dot will kind of show you the differences in these city sizes. Let's go to economic activity. Everyone really liked this map too because there are lots of pictures on it and it's very colorful. Whenever you hear the word economic, you should think money. Money, money, money. Economics is the exchange of money and how money moves. So if things are being bought or sold, stocks and bonds, if you've ever heard of things like that, trade in goods and things like that, resources and minerals and manufacturing, all of these keywords kind of fall under the bubble of economics. So what does this map specifically tell us? Well, let's look to our key. This map tells us how our land is being used, and it tells us what sources you can find there. So all the colors represent how the land is being used. Are the people using the land to hunt and gather, to farm, to herd animals, to raise livestock like cows, to fish commercially, which means to fish for like big business, for forestry, for taking in wood, for trade and manufacturing. Check this out. Let's use the trade and manufacturing as an example. We can see a lot of trade specifically, or in manufacturing, specifically in the north. Think about it. In the north, especially when you're not near a big ocean, fishing isn't always going to be your best bet. And when it's really cold, it's really difficult to farm. So how else can you make money? Well, you can make money by establishing factories and making things that you can buy and sell. So that is why up north you see a lot of manufacturing. In the south here, you can see we have a lot of farming and we have a lot of livestock raising. That makes sense. That's why people down here have farms. That's why you hear about ranches. Totally makes sense with where we live, because we live down here in this area, in this like orangish reddish area. Now let's talk about the resources. In our area, we live near a lot of petroleum or oil. We live near natural gas. There's a lot of coal. So that's why you might hear about people mining those things down here, because that's what it's available to us. So that is the economic map. Our last map are our political boundaries. Now this should look very familiar to you because this was our Mapping Challenge 2 activity, except this time it's all filled in for us. So what are political boundaries? Well, you should see these really dark black lines here. These divide countries from one another because political boundaries just tell us which sections of land are underneath the same government or are in charge by the same people or the same laws. The United States is all held underneath the same federal government. So we are all in the same political boundary. Now, we are in a separate political boundary from Canada because Canada has their own people that are in charge. They have their own rules, their own government, their own leaders. Same with Mexico. Mexico isn't labeled, but they are directly south of us in this big area down below. They have their own leaders. Now, you can see these dotted lines within the United States and within Canada. These are different sections of our countries. The United States sections are called states. Surprise, Texas is our state. And then Canada, we labeled some of these. These are their provinces, and they function somewhat similarly to states, but they're just the different sections of Canada. And you can see how they are divided with their dotted lines as well. All right, now that we are done going over the maps, let me tell you how to fill out the sheet. So let's go back to our challenge. You already grabbed, you should have this sheet now. So what we need to do is we need to go to the question number in our card. So let's go to our cards. Here's question number 1. Let's read the question first. It says, what is the largest area in Canada and in the United States that is densely populated, over 250 per square mile? What are 4 cities in that area? The first thing that you need to do is find which map you think you need to solve the problem. So if you hear about population density, that probably means I need to use my population density map. So I'm going to go into my worksheet, and the first thing I'm going to do for number 1 is circle the map that I need to do. So I would just circle where it says population density. Part 1 done. Now I need to actually answer the question, and I'm going to answer the question in this big long box here. So if I go back to my question, it asks me, what's the largest area that is densely populated? Okay, well, this is not very densely populated because my key tells me that the yellow is not densely populated. I'm looking for where most of the purple and red are. I see some purple and some red. Oh gosh, I see a lot of purple over here and I see a lot of red and orange. I'm going to go with this. So my answer is going to say that the northeastern part of the United States is the most densely populated. You should have heard that I used a complete sentence and that I addressed that part of the question, right? So I said the northeast part of the United States is the most densely populated. That's the first answer, part of the answer to question 1. But you should also catch that it says, what are 4 cities in that area? Well, whenever I go back, I see Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Washington. Done. So whenever I finish my answer, I say 4 cities in that area are Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. And all I did was write those responses in this first box. And you are totally allowed to copy down everything I just said for number 1. But then you are going to go through numbers 2 through 10. You are going to identify what map you need to solve the problem, and then you're going to do your best to answer that question. I'd really love to see complete sentences. However, I know that you're limited on space, so at least bullets with like complete thoughts are fine with me. So that is how you will finish challenge number 3. If you have any questions, just send me an email. Thanks. Bye. All right.